Good morning.
Morning.
Hi.
Hi, good morning. Make you guys co-hosts here.
Oh, great.
Perfect. All right. And then anyone else I need to add as co-host?
Doug Bradburn will eventually be joining us, our president and CEO.
Okay.
He'll probably he's just going to be talking. He's not going to be sharing anything. So I think he's just going to come kind of much closer to 1 o'clock.
Okay. So we can just kind of unmute him and
Yeah.
do. Okay, perfect. All right.
Hello.
Good morning or good afternoon. I guess depending on your time zone.
Are your class sizes always this large? This
So
is an impressive size.
So the classes are about 20 or so, but we're having everyone join in on this one. So we've got 10 teachers and their classes joining in. I have updated my internet to hope to be able to run all these. Good afternoon, everyone. I see joining. We're going to be starting hopefully right at 1. So if you need to go do anything or take a quick break. We'll be starting in about 10 minutes for everyone who's just joining.
Hello. Who's in charge?
Hi, good morning. Hi, or afternoon or evening. I know we've got people from all over the world joining us today. My name is Katie Smolar. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the Educational Director for the National History Academy. I want to thank you guys for joining us today for our Mount Vernon site visit. And I believe Dr. Doug Bradburn will be starting us off today.
Yes, well, Katie, it's nice to meet you, and it's lovely to see everybody here. My name is Doug Bradburn. I'm the president and CEO of George Washington's Mount Vernon. Welcome virtually to this extraordinary place. I see Patrick Bohr has an image of Mount Vernon as his backdrop, which might have been more appropriate for me to do, but I'm here by a portrait of George Washington. Of course, Mount Vernon is the home, the mansion, and the estate of George Washington. And it is an incredibly important site for the understanding of American history. Mount Vernon was a famous place at the time of the American Revolution because of the fame of George Washington. After the Americans won the war for independence, George Washington, of course, famously gave up his commission and went home. He gave up his military commission and went home. He came back to Mount Vernon. And so immediately, the first stories that this new American people would tell about who they were stories about George Washington, the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, who gave up power and came back to this place, Mount Vernon. So immediately, Mount Vernon went from being a fairly typical, although fairly typical large gentry estate of a Virginian elite in the 18th century to becoming a famous place for Americans to understand their identity. And so Americans would come to Mount Vernon in the 1780s. The visitors, diplomats from all over the world would come here. And remember, that time was a time when there was no U.S. capital, really. It moved around from Philadelphia to Trenton and all different places. And so Mount Vernon was actually a very important national space then. George Washington, of course, became president. He was the president of the Constitutional Convention, which I know you've learned quite a bit about. He became our first president and then died. And Mount Vernon itself would go on to become this iconic place for many Americans, and ultimately was saved in the 1850s by a group of women called the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. And they still own and operate Mount Vernon as a educational site. As a place for people to visit. We're in our 160th year of welcoming guests to understand the story of the founding and George Washington here at Mount Vernon. Now, and that's really extraordinary because at the time in the 1850s, when this group of women came together to save this place, the country was, of course, heading towards civil war. There was no national park system. There was no historic preservation movement. So they really invented the idea that you should preserve certain parts of your heritage for future generations to be able to talk about that heritage. And so from the beginning, American historic preservation has been wrapped up, and I know that's something that's very crucial to what you're doing in the History Academy, is in the story of who we are as a people and civics and civic and history understanding. So the women who led this movement to save this house believed very strongly that you have to tell the stories of our origins so that we can move forward together. Now, in the case of this institution, it has, as I said, welcomed since for the last 160 years about 90 million people. And it's been a place of pilgrimage as well as a place of education with visits not only from heads of state, but from school kids all over the world. So in a typical year, we get 1 million visitors at Mount Vernon coming to this place to learn about the legacy of George Washington. And we also, get tourists from all over the world. And so it is an authentic historic place in which you can actually learn about the people that lived here. Now, of course, this also was a slave plantation. George Washington was a slave owner. He grew up in an 18th century world in which slavery was the common form of labor for someone of anyone in Virginia who was trying to make a living. And this site, over the course of his lifetime at Mount Vernon, there were hundreds of people who were enslaved here. And in his death, in his will, he freed some of the people who labored here in slavery at the death of his wife Martha, but many others could not be freed because they were owned by Martha's family. And so slavery was a fact of life in Virginia in the 18th century. And so we teach that story here as well. And I know Sadie is going to take you through some of the story of Mount Vernon's 5 farms and the way agricultural labor worked here on the estate. And so whenever we talk about George Washington and his legacy, we have to hold in our minds these 2 realities, which we've inherited. And I think, as you all can recognize now, are very much a part of who we are. On the one hand, George Washington led a revolution in the favor of ideas of popular consent and the idea of equality and the rights of man enshrined in the Declaration of Independence and our fundamental values enshrined in the institution of the Constitution, which we still live under, which protects our rights to protest, which protects the separation of church and state, none of which would have existed without George Washington's leadership. There wouldn't be a Constitution without him. It wouldn't have come together when it did, it wouldn't have been ratified when it was, and it wouldn't have survived without his leadership as president. So he really is the father of the country in that sense. He's created and helped create the institutions that we've inherited, that we can use to shape the own character of our freedom. And the key about fighting a war of independence so that a people could be free is essentially that. We are the ones who can shape our future. And that's essentially why civics understanding and history understanding is so important. As you young people are going to be the leaders of this country, a free country that gets to shape its future, this is why you study the past and why you study your institutional character. Not so that you can attack the past, you do it so that you can attack the future. It empowers you to move forward in ways to shape these institutions to reflect your own values. Now, George Washington grew up in a world in which there wasn't in classrooms taught, that all men are created equal. The ideals of equality and popular consent did not exist when he was your age as something that was a standard for anybody to strive for. But he led a revolution that would institute and formalize those beliefs as the values of a new nation, the kind of which the world had never seen. At the time the United States was created, there were no democracies across the world that enshrined those points of view, and there were no institutions like our U.S. Constitution that attempted to share power across a grand scale to ensure justice, et cetera. So it is a remarkable story that we're all a part of, and you need to be able to have in your minds, on the one hand, these men in the 18th century were not like us. They didn't believe the same things we believe. They didn't grow up in the same way we grew up. They were different. They lived hundreds of years ago, but they left us a legacy that we can draw on to do better than them, to make our world more just, more fair as we move forward. And the other thing I would argue and emphasize for you is you learn about slavery at places like Mount Vernon. These are the lives of real people. They're real individuals who labored enslaved at Mount Vernon. This isn't an abstraction in some way that fits into some nice box. These are real families and real people who had skills and feelings and passions just like all of us. And that, of course, makes the tragedy even worse, that they suffered in a way that hopefully none of us have had to suffer in our lives. And their very existence here made George Washington's achievements possible. So their stories are fundamentally as important as his. And to try to get that across is also challenging. Because on the one hand, without places like Mount Vernon, you wouldn't be able to tell those individual stories. And it's the records of George Washington that allowed us to do that. In the 18th century, if you were an enslaved man or woman, you didn't get the same kind of baptismal records. You couldn't be married in a church. You didn't have the same kind of census records that were recording your life. And so it's only because of George Washington's management of his farms that we can tell these individual biographies here to the extent that we can. So I'd encourage you, even after your trip virtually today at Mount Vernon, where you will to look at some of the aspects of George Washington's leadership, but also the social character of the 18th century in this region of which he was a product, to go back and look at our webpage and pursue some of those names of the enslaved here at Mount Vernon, pursue some of the resources that are there for you to draw on, and be strong citizens as you move forward, and take the knowledge of the past that you have to make a positive change in the world. Because again, you can't do anything about what happened in the 18th century, but you can do something about what's going to happen 2 years, 5 years, 10 years from now. And that's the importance of programs that you're in. We're delighted to be a part of it. Katie, I'm delighted to have been able to welcome everybody here. I hope at some point to welcome you in the real flesh and blood world of a non-COVID world. And with that, I think I have completed my welcome. Katie, is there anything else you'd like from me before I hand it over to Sadie?
Great. No, thank you so much, Dr. Bradburn. We really appreciate you coming for us today.
Can I see a show of hands? How many of you have watched the Hamilton musical or listened to the lyrics? Pretty good stuff. I interviewed Chris Jackson yesterday for our members, he's the guy that played George Washington in the original cast. And he came to Mount Vernon to learn about Washington and learn about his story. And I just think it's an extraordinary, you're incredibly lucky to have the Hamilton musical in your lives. I didn't have that in my life when I was your age. You're living in an age of Shakespeare. I mean, that's a tremendous work of art, and I'm delighted that you could enjoy it. Sadie, do you want to take it away? And I will say goodbye. Good luck.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you, Dr. Bradburn, for that great introduction, for joining us. And hi, everyone. I'm kind of gonna use a little bit of our time to build on some of the great things that Dr. Bradburn just said. And I want to reiterate everything he said, especially the welcome and the thank you for letting Mount Vernon be a part of this class and this study, and for signing up to join us. I'm here with my colleague, Jeremy Ray, who on my screen, oh, there he is. I was gonna say, just completely disappeared. And as Doug said, or Dr. Bradburn, we're sad to not welcome you to Mount Vernon, but we want to use this time to really bring a piece of Mount Vernon to you all, and a piece of George Washington and the entire history of Mount Vernon and all of the people that lived there and labored there, whether by free choice or by force. So we're excited to be a part of this. I'm loving these comments all about Hamilton that you guys are having in the chat. And so I'm very excited that you all are using the chat. Because the way that we're kind of going to break this down is I'm going to spend the next half hour or so with you guys going through a primary source analysis. And I know that just exudes excitement and fun, and like you're jumping out of your seats because you can't wait to just look at a primary source and analyze it. So I totally get it. I understand. But I'd like to keep it as very interactive as possible. I know that there's a big group. I'm looking down. We have 201 participants in this chat. I've never been a part of a Zoom call this big. So I'm excited for it. But I definitely want you guys to use the chat, because I'm going to ask you questions and I'd love to get your feedback, because there are a lot of topics to talk about, a lot of things to dive into. And so when I put things out there, definitely please write back. I'm going to give you a full disclaimer. I am terrible with names. So I'm just going to go ahead and get every single person's name wrong. I'm so bad with names. I don't even have my real name on the screen. If you can see it saying Stroy, because I'm Sadie Troy, and I don't know how to fix names in Zoom, but I'm so bad with names, I got mine wrong. So my name's Sadie. I'm our student learning specialist. I work in our education department, and my goal is to connect with students, to create resources and outreach, to find different ways to teach about the 18th century to students, because that is how museums see our role today. Like the legacy of the history that we're going to talk about, it's hard, it's dark, and it still affects us today. And museums, we love our primary sources because that is how we can really go back to the facts. Why the history turned out the way it did, why we're fighting the battles we are today, why we're fighting the injustice that we are today, all stems from the past that we talk about and discuss. And so that's what we love about our primary sources. And so the one that we're going to use today, Dr. Bradburn kind of mentioned it. It is a piece from Washington's personal life, from his time at Mount Vernon. I know this week, you guys, if you want to type in the chat some of the things that you're learning this week, because I know it's kind of on the foundations of the government, right? Is that So, okay, so Annie says you guys are studying James Madison. Okay, Kushi says Constitutional Convention. Oh God, look, they're just, okay, good. The Constitution, the US Constitution. Ooh, Sebastian's mentioning the Articles of Confederation, federal negatives. Great, okay, so you guys are getting a lot of the political parts of George Washington. Jonah, you guys talking about states had different currencies, right? One of the failures of the Articles of Confederation. So you're talking about the political side in George Washington's public persona through the creation, as Lucian says, the creation of the federal government. Joshua says his involvement in federalism, because Washington's involved in this in every step of the way, right? What position did he hold during the Constitutional Convention? Have you guys already gotten there? Do you guys know what he did in the Constitutional Convention? Oh, good. Okay. He was, all right, all of you are, yeah, he was the chair, he was the president, so he was very involved. But as Dr. Bradburn said, right, he oversaw it, he was the chair. As Dr. Bradburn mentioned, you really can't separate Washington's personal life from his political life. All of that was a part of his legacy, the good and the bad, and the things that happened at Mount Vernon. The production of crops, the forced labor of enslaved workers. Washington is able to do all of his work politically because of what is happening at home. So you cannot separate that. And so that's a big part of what Jeremy and I wanted to talk with you guys today about, was how his personal life really fits into that narrative. And I like that, Joshua. He had a quiet and non-public life before being president. Yeah, and he tried to have it before, he tried to have it during, he tried to have it after, but the poor guy never got a break. But that's his own doing. No pity here. So the way that we're going to do it is we are going to look at a primary source image, and it is a map. Oh, I don't think I was supposed to tell you that. I think that was one of the things we were going to figure out together. But the way that we're going to do this analysis is we're going to do it in 3 steps. And this is a tactic that we stole from in our education department from our curators, from our archaeologists, and from our historical architects. This is what they use. We're going to do a three section questionnaire basically about our primary source. And each level of questioning is going to take us to deeper understandings about the object and help us pull out more information from it. Our first steps, we're just going to simply observe our source. We're going to engage with it. We're just going to ask basic questions just to kind of contextualize and figure out what it is. Because maybe it's a map, but maybe it's not a map. Who knows? Our second step, we're going to push our inquiry further. We're going to do a much closer reading of the source and really make sense out of it. And then step 3, our questions are going to pull all of our critical thinking skills together. We're going to take what we learned from the source and add it to the information that you guys already know about the 18th century. And based on information that you guys are telling me about the Constitutional Convention, the Articles of Confederation, Shays' Rebellion, you guys know a lot about the 18th century. So, Gabriel, you don't know if it's going to be a map. You don't know. But so that third step, so we're going to take those skills, take that information, and we're going to make educated guesses about how this primary source fits into the larger historical narrative and really pulls out extra information. Okay? So, it's probably not a map. It could be a map, as you guys are still saying, but we're going to observe and engage it. We're going to make inquiries and sense about it, and then we're going to use historical evidence to make critical thinking guesses about its place in the larger narrative. I promise I'm not going to talk so long. I'm not going to talk as fast. Keep these topics in the chat coming. I want it to be super back and forth. Okay, so I'm ready to pull up our primary source. And, okay, here it is. Okay, So, can everyone see it? Okay, so let's not get ahead of ourselves and just start naming what it is just yet. But what I want to do, I just want to make sure that the screen is clear so that you guys can see it. Okay, all right, so here's our source. And this really is a great interactive because, like, look at it. Look at how close to this source we can get and how I can move things around. So we're gonna be playing with this for a little bit. But, all right, so for our analysis, we're gonna do our level 1 questions, okay? And so the way that we're gonna do it, I'm gonna ask you guys questions and you can just kind of answer them mentally, or type them in the chat as you go, okay? Type them in the chat as you go and we'll kind of have a little debrief after each set, okay? So we have, all right, first levels, we're just observing, getting to know the source. So question. What does this image show? All right, the chat's blown up and I'm loving some of these answers. And look, a lot of you are guessing that it's a map. It's a map, yay. All right, so what does this image show? Okay. Is there a title for this image? I guess I can, let me move this around. Is there a title for this image? Okay. What did you all notice first when I pulled this on the screen? What did you notice first about this image? So take it over, just keep pulling out different items. Okay. What names are included within this image? I'm seeing a lot of good stuff coming through this chat, a lot of names. What names are you seeing in this image? Is there nature depicted within this image? What kinds of nature? Okay. Are there buildings depicted in this image? Are there buildings? If so, where are the buildings? Okay. Anything that you noticed on this map that you can't explain or didn't expect? I'm reading some of these and I'm loving these. So just tell us about this, what you see that you didn't expect. Okay, so again, I'm just gonna run through those questions that we asked that were our observations, right? All we wanted to know was, what does the image show? Did we find a title for it? What was the first thing that stood out for all of us? Did we notice any names written throughout? Was nature depicted? What types of nature? The buildings, how many were there? Where are they? Are there even any pictured? And then things we couldn't explain and couldn't talk about. Okay, so you guys let's talk about our observations, because you guys, I'm going to try and scroll up because you guys, through the chat, because you guys pulled out a lot of great information through all these. So first of all, right off the bat, you guys figured out this is a map. This is a map. And it's a big map, as a lot of people said. As some people said, that this really was a big map. I'm just going to go down here to the bottom. And a lot of you noticed the title. So, and I'm going to pull the title up because some people said that it's hard to see, right? And especially because it's cursive. Do you guys still study cursive? How many, you can use the chat, how many out there still have to study cursive in school? Does anybody? So Annie says yes. Ooh, Eleanor said in 2nd grade. That's a long time ago. So Amy's yes, Carmen's no, Thomas is no. Okay, so Juan did it in 6th grade, elementary. Okay, so it's been a while since some of you have done cursive. But so the title is, a lot of you found it. And this is really important when we observe to find it out. And the title is A Map of George Washington's Farm of Mount Vernon from a Drawing Transmitted by the General. So go ahead and keep typing in that chat. Who's the general? So we're reading that the map, it's of George Washington's farm, drawing transmitted by the general. Okay, perfect. Victoria's got it. Joshua, Amy, names are flying in super fast. Emma, Kevin, Sydney, you all are nailing it right on the head. So Washington drew this map. So this is a map of his farm. So just by observing of it, we now know what it is and who made it. All right, you guys said that there were a lot of nature aspects. A lot of you talked about farms. Ooh, Annie had a great question, meaning it must have been made during the Revolutionary War. So that's a great question because it refers to Washington as the general. So this was made after the Revolutionary War. This was made later in Washington's life during his retirement, but that is always a title that he kept. So sometimes even during his presidency and post-presidency, it was always kind of the term that he preferred and that people knew him as. So that's a great question to connect it to the Revolutionary War, but this actually happens later. Ooh, and you guys are saying he also fought in the French and Indian War. So he's got a lot of military experience with that. Okay, and so we can talk about that. So he does have drawing experience. So if he drew this in Washington's time, what is the profession that makes maps? Can you guys type all that in? Okay, so a lot of you, yeah. So the cartographer is the one that makes maps, and a lot of you are saying that. And then, so who is the one that goes out into the wilderness, measures the land to actually, survey the area and put it into a map? And so you guys are all getting it. Samuel's got it, Lauren, Stephen, Amy. So Washington was a surveyor. That's one of the very first jobs that he did. Growing up in his early years, he was a surveyor. He was actually a surveyor for the British Crown. And so he understood how to draw maps, how to survey the land, how to lay out the foundations. He did this for cities and in the country. And that helped him during his time during the French and Indian War, as a lot of you all just said, that he was the general he was in the army at that time. He wasn't the general yet. But because of his knowledge of the land, because of his experience kind of in the wilderness as the surveyor, he was relied upon during his time in the French and Indian War. And then because of his experience during the French and Indian War, what role did he get in the Revolutionary War? What role did Washington have? Yeah. Ooh, I got that. Yes. So Bryceland, you got it. Javi's got it. Yeah, so he was the general. He was the commander-in-chief. So all of the skills he's kind of building on, and Jeremy's going to cover this in his house tour, I promise. But he, so his work at understanding the land helped give him a spot in the army during the French and Indian War, and that experience put him into as commander-in-chief. So he's learning these skills, and he's continuing to build and grow, and then he continues to practice them. He's still surveying later in his life. So I'm really happy. Thank you guys for bringing that up. We're looking at the nature aspects now. A lot of you noticed that there were a lot of rivers. Why are rivers so important in Washington's time in the 18th century? Why is a river important? Why was it very necessary to make sure those got on the map? As Raul says, transportation. Christy Lee says transportation. Amy says farming. Trading. Trade and communication is what Madeline said. So trading, traveling, communication. Oh my God, I'm at like 30 new messages. This is great. It helped travel. It made good farmland, agriculture, right? There, it's going to help water crops. So the rivers are super important. So that's a really big, natural element to pull out the irrigation, as Mia is saying. And so we see rivers. We see a lot of what's kind of here in the middle, all these different, the middle areas covered. So they're woods and trees. And so then the open areas, so we have open lands with trees. And then the large squares, what are those large squares? So Avery's right. So those are the farms. Those are the farms. Those are the different fields. So we talked about so we talked about nature and the buildings. All right, you guys pulled out that there are buildings here. A lot of you noticed the buildings down right by the water on Mansion House Farm. They're right here. You can see, and it's even titled Mount Vernon. So this is the house of Mount Vernon. But then some of you noticed at Union Farm, there were other buildings there too. You have these dark squares that match, so they're the same type of buildings. As Jaden just said, there are also buildings here on River Farm. So you have buildings spread out. And so what type of buildings, if these are in the middle of the farms, in the middle of the fields, who's living in these buildings? Right, so a lot of you, so these are locations for the enslaved community. So these are for the enslaved laborers and the overseers living in these different fields. So now through this map, not only are we getting a sense that where Washington lives, but now we're seeing who else is living on this space. Because I think one of the very important things that this map points out is that, as you can see, as the title suggested, it's a map of George Washington's farm of Mount Vernon. Mount Vernon is not just the name of that one house, the building, but it is the entire plantation. It is the name of the entire space and was home to over 300 people living here. That includes Washington, his family, hired white workers, and then enslaved African Americans all throughout. And so by looking at this map, by taking that kind of observation, we can see these dark squares here in these homes. Okay, great. So we have kind of a great base knowledge just from strictly observing this map about what this is. And we've pulled out some information. And now I want to take us to our second level of questioning. All right, and this is where we're going to inquire a little more deeply and make sense out of just those different facts that we pulled out. Because that's what our first set, our first questions are just to get the facts. Now we're going to try and start making sense of this. So it's going to be more larger idea questions. All right, again, you can use the chat if you'd like. So questions for our second level. What do you think is the subject of this map? So what do you think is the overall subject of this map? Why would Washington want to create this map? Why do you think Washington would want to create this map? I'm just reading your chats and these are great. You're talking about ownership, you're talking about legacy, property layout, organization of the farm, to know his surroundings, to know where his land ends, to mark the land he owned, to make sure it was maintained, just to make a record of it. So you guys are putting great answers in. All right, so who do you think is the audience for this map? Who did Washington create this map for? Ooh, and I like that some of you are using question marks. I think Javi did that. Like, we don't have to know every answer, right? We're learning about this for the first time. So who is his audience? Are the same people reading this map the same people that are working in its depicted areas? And I should say, with our analysis, these aren't yes or no questions. We are trying to learn as much from this as possible. And as historians, we're always asking questions. Okay. What kind of technology would have been used to make this map? Think of the different technology at the time. People are using compasses, ink and pens, printing presses, ooh, scaling tools, feather pen, draft table. Why is this an important map to look at? Why is this important? You guys have all different questions, ranging from it's not important to it shows what Mount Vernon looked like during his time. You guys are saying that it shows insight into how much land Washington owned. I think it shows how he and his slaves lived. It shows his wealth and influence. It shows his skill as a surveyor. I think I saw that in there. So a lot of different reasons. Okay. So those are our questions for round 2. We were just simply kind of pulling out, deeper, more asking deeper questions. What is the subject? You guys knew the subject was Mount Vernon. It's a whole Mount Vernon map of the surrounding areas, of the layout of the land that was there, of the entire plantation. Why did he create this map? As you guys said, for boundaries, to understand his land, to divide his fields, to accurately represent how much land he has, or where different fields are, where different farms are. Washington was also, very big into crop rotation, knowing how much land is under acreage for farming, knowing how much land is still as woods for, different materials. So there are all these different reasons. I love the technology that you guys brought out thinking about that. So again, we're kind of looking at this bigger picture, right? Is Washington using this to know his land, to know how many people are living on it, how many spaces are being worked? So there's a lot of information we can pull out from this to learn more about daily life, right? In his time. We've talked about houses. Those are by the fields where the enslaved workers are living. So they're working in the same space. We know where Washington's living, with access to the waters or the different rivers that and pathways he can traverse through his lands. So there's a lot of stuff we're pulling out. The final stage, their third level of questions, is where we put all this information that you're gathering from this source and connect it with 18th century knowledge you already know. So we're going to start making educated guesses about really deep information that we can learn. Like, what can this map teach us about George Washington? You know, what are some things about George Washington that we can learn from this map? Sumitra, he was wealthy. Where he lived. Carter, that he was a planter, right? We know a lot about Washington's political and military life. But Axel says that he was a member of the gentry because of his wealth and status. Lucas, he appreciated details. That he was really into agriculture. Sophia said because he had money. Somebody said because he had nice handwriting. That he had personal interests in farming. That he had vast lands. And that's exactly right. Washington made his wealth in the land. He did not make money in the military or politics. This is where his money, this is where his wealth came from. We can see from this map his surveying skills. So skills that he had acquired from a young age, he's still using them. We can see that he supported slavery and the institution from this map, right? Because he has these large plots and these fields to grow the different wheat. And he's not the one in those fields. He's not the one living in those cabins on River Farm or Union Farm or doing that wealth, right? This kind of pulls into our other questions because we're learning all this about George Washington. As Eleanor said, his real passion was farming. You know, we know that he tried to step away from military life and political life multiple times to return to Mount Vernon, to return to the farm. What is this map teaching us about Mount Vernon? So if we take it further than Washington, what is this map telling us about Mount Vernon? Oh, Madeline, there was a disconnect between him and poorer farmers in the nation, right? Do we think that everyone was living on a farm this size? And some of you pointed out that one of the first things you looked at was the scale. It's a big plantation. This is 8,000 acres. That's 8,000 FIFA soccer fields all lined up together. So it's highly expansive. I liked that word that you guys used for it. So it's a very large farm. It puts it puts Mount Vernon in a status above others. It's located on a lucrative piece of land. Sonara said that. Absolutely, you have that river that cuts through, the rivers going through for the trade. It's in, what are some others? It's located in a neat organizational pattern. So, and it's a large living space. And I like to someone point out, it's not just home to Mount Vernon or to George Washington. Mount Vernon isn't the name of a house, right? It's a name of an entire living space. Keep building on this pattern. What is this map teaching us about the enslaved population at Mount Vernon? So what is this map that was not made probably to provide to the enslaved people, was not made for them at a time when their humanity was questioned and denied? What can we learn about this? What can we learn about these individual people who lived there? Bryceland, there was a high population of slaves, right? If there's going to be this much land, it's going to be a large workforce. So much space required a lot of work. Gina, Mount Vernon relied on slaves. Absolutely, they played a giant role in making Mount Vernon what it was. Annie said they're literally across the river from a free state of Maryland. Geographic separation of the main house. I like that. Without slaves, Mount Vernon would be nothing, because somebody asked, did Washington do his own labor? He did not when we're talking about field labor or trades like carpentry, blacksmith, cobblers, coopers. Did I get that wrong? Okay, good. You guys are all correcting me. Maryland is not. My history. I'm trying to scroll through here for what you guys are pulling through. Maryland was not a free state. Thank you. I was reading too quickly on people's. See, I'm glad you guys are here to correct me. But so we learn a lot. We learned where they lived, where some of them lived. We learned that they were not just singular cabins. It was very much, they lived within communities within the farm that they worked. They lived by where they worked. The final question that we're asking, and I love that people are pointing out that they're skilled laborers. Some people mentioned that in the chat. Relying on their labor, I mean, they were the ones growing the wheat, the cash crop, providing for it. They are a very skilled workforce on these spaces. The final question that we always ask when we do our analysis, when our curators, when our archaeologists do our analysis of our sources, what questions do we still have? Because as historians diving deeper into topics, there's always more to research. There's always more information, and lucky for us, we still have like another hour or so together, and Jeremy Ray's gonna take over and can hopefully work in some of these questions. But when we look at this, what are the questions that we still have? Was Washington pro or against slavery? Will Washington give equality to his slaves? How were the slaves treated? How old is this historical site? Where does the wealth come from? So I'm loving all these questions to further us and dive, because primary sources are awesome and they can teach us a lot of information, but they're just one puzzle piece in a whole larger narrative. And so we need to put them together with more research and more primary sources to really understand the larger viewpoints and the larger narrative as total. Jeremy, I hope you're looking at some of these questions because I think they're incredible. What was Washington's changing views on slavery? Has the land changed from then and now? There's a lot of great pieces here, and I'm impressed by the analysis that they did and the information, the topics they pulled out from it. And I'm hoping to pass it over to you to take it further and actually show them more visually of the plantation.
Yes, great. So thank you, Sadie. And excellent questions, everybody. Hopefully I will be able to address all of them as we go through. So let's just jump right into it. Give me a second to share the screen. Oh, and there was a question earlier about George Washington being named General of the Armies, and I sent a YouTube link in there. It's just on our website, our YouTube channel. Go to youtube.com and then find Mount Vernon's channel. It's actually a video of me explaining the progression of George Washington's ranks and how that was signified. So that's a pretty interesting thing there. Give me a second to share this. Maximize the screen out. All right, so here we are virtually looking at the Mansion House Farm. One of the things in the comments that I saw is a lot of confusion. Mount Vernon is not the house. Mount Vernon is the total estate. So all 5 farms that make up the plantation is Mount Vernon. Washington referred to this as the Mansion House Farm. And if you give me a second here, we'll briefly take a look around. It is flanked on either side by 2 buildings with these attaching colonnades. This building here is the Servants' Hall, and that's what Washington called it. It was for the, quote, servants of his visiting guests. So Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, George Mason all visited here. We know that. Traveling with them were coachmen, butlers, and valets, and they would stay in this building here. It was never very clear whether it was enslaved people or hired people. We just have the listing of Servants' Hall, right? And what's interesting to note is that people who are staying in this building are more than likely not literate. Even if they aren't enslaved people, they probably did not have the opportunity for an education. So we don't really have anyone's record on it. And that's, I think, an important thing to take away when we're going through a lot of these primary sources, primary source documentation, is to keep in mind the perspective that we're receiving, right? Washington and his guests very much were a very different level of society than most people in Virginia or the United States at that time. Here we have the North Lane with a bunch of support buildings called dependencies. This first one here is the gardener's house, where a hired gardener lived in charge of writing reports and taking care of the gardens. He usually had a couple of enslaved men who worked with him in maintaining the gardens. We have a salt house, then we have a spinning room, and then overseer's quarters. We'll go and look at those in a little bit more detail later on. As we look towards the west, so I noticed somebody pointed out that there looked like there was a little pond next to the house on the map that Sadie was showing. It actually isn't a pond. It was this bowling green. It was a manicured green space that he specifically put out on the map to show that this was a space set up intentionally for entertainment for Washington's guests to go walking along on the grounds along these serpentine paths on either side. There's a garden over here. There's a garden over here that's producing all the produce for the kitchen. And this expanse goes way out. I mean, that's all of Washington's property that makes Mount Vernon out into that distance. Over here, we have the South Lane. Again, more working buildings, a storehouse that's stored under lock and key. The tools that were used by the enslaved people on the estate here around the Mansion House farm. And we also have a smokehouse, a laundry building, carriage house, coach house. All of these are made of wood, and actually our original date back to the 1770s when they were built, except for the stable here. This one is made of brick. It was made of wood at one point in time. There was actually a fire in like 1794 when Washington had the building reconstructed. It was made out of brick. This is the kitchen. It was kept separate and away from the house. Let me actually pop up the chats here. It's going so fast. You guys are so quick, and I'm an old struggling to keep up with it all. But the question is, why do you suppose, and for some reason I can't, there we go, can't get it to come up. Why do you suppose the kitchen was kept separate? So Madeline said because of slaves, and then they had to prevent fires, cleanliness. It was manned by slaves. So yeah, here's the thing. You often hear when you go to a lot of particularly southern plantation sites that have the houses and the kitchen was separate. And they said, well, why is the kitchen separate? Oh, it's because of the risk of fire. You know, there always have fires going in the kitchen, and if the kitchen catches fire, you don't want to take the house down with it. Well, that would make sense, except for the fact that there's a wooden colonnade that actually connects the buildings, right? If the kitchen catches on fire, the house is going up too. It also ignores the fact that there are 13 fireplaces inside this wooden building. The reality is it was kept separate because it was enslaved people that were working inside the kitchen. It's a hot place, it's very smoky, and it was part of what people would do to kind of keep that separate at the time. Even the design of the estate itself, right? This east-west axis, right? This is all for entertaining Washington's guests, right? And look how pretty. You've got all these beautiful trees on either side, this big open field. The other side, it's a big view, unimpeded view of the river. But then when we go north and south, we have work buildings being done, worked in by enslaved people. Oh, screen just kind of cut out. There we go. And we have the South Lane also being worked by enslaved people, right? So Washington specifically designed the landscape for the entertainment and enjoyment of his guests while blocking out the work being done by enslaved people. There was very much a separation of the classes in society in the 18th century. A lot of great questions in here. I promise I'll get to a lot of them about the good slave owner and all that. That's probably the number one question that we get here at Mount Vernon. Was George Washington a good slave owner? And I will specifically address that one as we go along. So here we have the Mansion House. This is how it looked in 1799. We'll zoom in a little bit. The Washington family actually owned Mount Vernon going all the way back to 1674. It was given as a land grant to his great-grandfather. Now, that's an interesting statement, right? It was the King of England who actually gave it as a land grant to the Washington family. Now, a land grant effectively means the king says, I have all this land, I'm going to give it to you, right? Don't worry, Gabrielle, we'll get to it. And believe me, I'll just go ahead and say it now, there's no such thing as a good slave owner, right? We will get to you, I promise that. In 1674, it was given as a land grant by the King of England to the Washington family. Now, that just means that this was land that the king says, all right, you guys can take it, right? I'm giving it to you. But where did that land come from, right? The land was owned or inhabited for centuries by the indigenous people here. There were the Doeg tribe, the Piscataway tribe, all lived in this area. As the English came in and settled Virginia, starting out in Jamestown and then moving up along the coastal ways of these large navigable rivers, right? They started pushing out those people and started taking over. So Washington's family built a property here sometime in 1674. This house did not look like this. We know that in the 1730s, Washington's father built a home that consisted of effectively this space here, right? The center door and then the two windows on either side of us, either side of it. It was a 1.5-story structure, and Washington inherits this from his older half-brother Lawrence, who died, and moves into it in 1754. When Washington moved in, he immediately begins expanding the house. First, he adds a floor up, so everything you're seeing inside of these chimneys, he adds in the 1750s. In 1774, he adds the south wing, everything outside of this chimney. It was the private wing, right? And then the left side over here, he begins building in 1776. So again, it's important to remember that Washington didn't purchase this property. He was effectively given this property from the family already owning it. His father owned several different tracts of land throughout Virginia. Washington's father had the Mount Vernon property. He had a Ferry Farm outside of Fredericksburg, Virginia, and Pope's Creek Plantation, which was down off of the Potomac River a little further south. All right, so let's go on inside here and begin the first room. Okay, so this space here is called the New Room. It's because it was the last room that Washington added on to the house in over 30 years of expansion. So I'll do a quick kind of scroll around here so you can see. This room was very impressive in the 18th century. The average Virginia farmer's home in the 18th century could fit inside this one room. So again, it really shows the difference in wealth between Washington, kind of your average American at the time. Washington had this really set up in the salon style. So you see a lot of the artwork on the wall. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And also had this big grand window that helps let in a lot of light. So this was kind of like a grand ballroom space. Washington used this for dancing. You can see here that the furniture is moved around to the outside of the room. It's at rest. But also large dining tables could be brought in for large, more formal dining events could take place in here, right? So Washington sets this place up, and I really think it does a good job of detailing Washington's past, present, and then future for the room, right? So I want to take a look over here. Here we have an original print. It is the death of General Montgomery, right? So this is a man who was a good friend of Washington's, right? He was killed at the Battle of Quebec very early on in the Revolutionary War. Attack took place in 1775. Yeah, so this is a sketch. So not a painting, but a sketch. So kind of a smaller replica of an earlier painting. So Washington has this, and if I'll scroll over to the other side, we have another one. It's the Battle of Bunker Hill, right? And it's showing the death of General Joseph Warren. So here in this big room where he is entertaining a lot of his guests, he has 4 prints, 2 sets each, of these scenes that took place during the Revolutionary War. Prominent generals, friends of Washington, dying. So this really goes to show, yeah, there was a Montgomery in World War II as well. He was British. But yes, he's showing Washington's past as a general, right? And so he's reminding everybody of the sacrifice that it took to secure America's independence as he's entertaining people in here. But I also want to take a moment to point out that he also has these other prints. He has 2 of these prints in the room, and it's called The Dead Soldier. Now, it's hard to see because I can't make the text drop down, but it is a man who's obviously dead. And here we have his wife and a newborn child, and she's obviously mourning him. And in the background, we see a cannon, but we also see that a battle is raging, right? So what we have here is Washington, of course, very much a high member of society. He's got these images of people that he knew, these generals, these high-level folks, but he also shows the average sacrifice of everyday Americans during the war, right? Here's a person who was not really deemed important enough to even have a name. He's just a dead soldier. But the sacrifice is not only given up by common Americans who died during the conflict, but also the run-on effects that had, right? You now had widows. You now had children who were orphaned. Yes, the F is it was a very nice touch. I'm not so old that I don't get that reference, though. That's pretty funny. But the baby now is not going to have a father when he's growing up. The wife lost a husband. And again, I think it really highlights that past of everything that had to be given up. Now, as we return, Washington's also showing designs in the design of the room, his present, right? And his kind of vision for the country. Now, take a look here at this fireplace. This is an original marble mantelpiece. It was a gift to Washington from an English admirer. And it's got, of course, a little bubble gives it away. We zoom in, agricultural motifs, right? So we see cattle, we see sheep, right? And if we take a look up in the ceiling, we see farming implements, right? So we have wheat here in the center. And you can see some farm implements over here, right? So all of these remind everybody that Washington here, Mount Vernon, was a farm. The primary cash crop was wheat, right? So that's the present. He retires from the Revolutionary War to become a farmer back here on the estate. And so somebody else asked about the paintings. The paintings are actually a very interesting nod to Washington's future, right? These are all of the same thing, right? At the Potomac River. We have the Hudson River. This one is unknown, so it doesn't have a little bubble, but you also see some water. Yeah, much better than popcorn ceiling, I agree with you. Another one of the Potomac River. And then over here, another one, this is Genesee Falls. Right, so all of these rivers are very important. Rivers were the highways of the 18th century, and Washington in this room is advertising to all of his guests about expanding out to the west along these large navigable rivers. So here we have Washington's view of the Potomac. Did Washington paint? No, those are original paintings done by William Winstanley and George Beck. John Beck. Beck was the last name. I can't remember his first name, but anyway, those are all original. Washington actually had them commissioned, right, to hang up in the room. So here we see the Potomac River, again, a big source of navigation in Washington's time. And we also see the lovely landscape. Now, interesting, the landscape here, we can see, you see these berms right here. This is how it bulges up and how this part goes down. All of this was done intentionally, right? Washington wanted an unencumbered view of the river. And those berms are actually where they dug out to put in the basement, the cellar, which was used for food storage. Of course, all of that work is being done by enslaved people, right? There were 317 enslaved individuals on the estate by 1799. 123 were owned outright by George Washington. 153 were part of the Custis Dower estate. That's because Mrs. Washington was married once before to a Daniel Parke Custis. When Daniel Parke Custis died, he died without a will. So the state of Virginia held all of that property to be passed along to the Custis heirs. So that means they were held for Mrs. Washington's grandchildren eventually. There were 40 enslaved people here who were actually rented. George Washington purchased land and rented 40 enslaved people from his neighbor Penelope French as part of that land deal. And then there was one man who was here as Peter Hardiman, who was part of a purchase of a horse. So Washington purchased a race horse from the estate of his stepson who passed away. And this man, Peter Hardiman, came as part of that. So again, really goes to show how at the time, Washington, many of the founding fathers were so much steeped in these racist ideals that had to kind of be used to justify slavery within their own minds, that they didn't even view these people as people. They really viewed it as a means of property, as a means of advancing their wealth. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we step into this next section here. So this is the central passage, and it is the oldest section of the home. So let me give you a quick scroll through. We have a bed chamber right off the door to the inside. It's me here. It's an original painting of the Battle of Minden, which took place during what we call the French and Indian War, but it took place in Europe as part of the Greater 7 Years' War. It's a good question. If the Washington state was a land grant, was Washington ever fond or loyal to the king? In fact, most Americans were. At the beginning of the Revolutionary War, they were still giving toast to the King of England. The first flag that Washington had flown when he was outside of Boston was the 13 stripes for the 13 colonies. And in the field now where we have the 50 blue stars, it was actually the British Union Jack. Their issue was with Parliament, taxation without representation. They were looking for reconciliation initially with Parliament, and they were actually hoping that the king could help in that. So that's kind of an interesting aside. It wasn't until the king returned the olive branch petition and declared them all in a state of rebellion that their attitudes changed and started pushing more towards independence. So this is the dining room, the second room off of the passageway. Let's go back, switch over to the other side. This is an informal parlor, or little parlor. It's kind of like a family room. You see, this is the original harpsichord that was a gift from General Washington to Mrs. Washington's granddaughter, Nellie Custis. A harpsichord is like a piano, but instead of having a hammer strike the keys, it plucks it, so it sounds more like a harp. See some artwork on the wall that was done by Nellie Custis, Mrs. Washington's granddaughter. Nellie's bird cage. Yes, the blue color, all the colors on the wall are as accurate as we can tell based off of our analysis to the year 1799. Somebody asked if that blue is the original color. Again, to the best that we can determine it. As technology gets better, they did a paint analysis here in this hallway, and not too long ago, the whole hallway was painted like this door right here with this fake paint on it. The paint analysis determined there were like 7 layers of paint there, but now with lasers, they're actually able to determine there were 15 layers, and they think that this cream color was actually there in 1799. One last room, this formal parlor. Paint itself was very expensive, so having anything outside of whitewash was a sign of wealth. So here's this formal parlor. This was probably one of the fanciest rooms Washington would have guests come into before dinner. They would discuss news, politics, read the newspaper of the day. My favorite item in this room is actually this painting. First off, Washington had it built into the wall, so that was kind of interesting. But it's also the oldest piece in the entire house. Not really, there we go. They called it a neat landscape. It's just some ships and all that. And this is kind of Washington's establishing himself in the gentry society in the 1750s as one of his first purchases. But I also want to take note here, because I'm going to get back to this, is Washington built out his family coat of arms into the wall here above the fireplace. All right, it was one of the oldest paintings of Washington in his French and Indian War uniform. And then here is Mrs. Washington. All right, so the central passage here was the oldest part of the house. And it was always the hub of the home, because there was entertainment that was done in this space. Furniture could be moved, and this hallway itself could be opened up for dancing. But it's also where visitors came and were greeted and then determined where to go to visit with General Washington. And this door right here plays a very critical part of that. Visitors were greeted at this doorway by Frank Lee, the enslaved butler. Now, George Washington purchased Frank Lee and his brother William Lee from a nearby family in the 1760s. William Lee served as Washington's enslaved valet, so it's kind of personal assistant, and Frank Lee was the butler in the house. And Frank Lee's duties, as assigned by Washington, was to greet guests at the doorway and then determine where to go to meet for the Washingtons. If Frank could determine if they were of a lower estate, then they would wait outside or be sent to one of the farm managers. Others might wait here in the hallway, or Frank might invite them to step into one of these parlors. All right. So Frank Lee was very much here and around at any point in time. When they're inside the parlor, right, and they're discussing news and politics, and they're discussing John Locke, right? And he's saying that John Locke is saying things like, we have the inherent rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. Well, Frank Lee's there in the room when he's having that conversation. And what is property? Well, they're going to then argue that property is, if you are the one who is putting in the work to produce it, then that thing is owned by you. Where this disconnect is, right? Because George Washington here on this estate, right, this plantation, is George Washington actually out in the fields doing the work to make the cash crop? No, enslaved people are, right? So who does that property actually belong to? And yet here we go again, we have people that by the laws of Virginia at the time says that because these folks are black, basically those are the laws at the time, right, that they are suited for enslavement, and therefore George Washington can own them. So that's kind of a big disconnect when you see this. And you're looking at documents like the Declaration of Independence, where it says all men are created equal, right? Knowing very well that that statement does not apply to women, does not apply to men who aren't white, does not apply to white men who don't own property, right? So the statement in and of itself is one of the most anti-racist statements ever made, but is made by people who hold racist views. And I think that's important, going back to what Dr. Bradburn said, is that you can use the past to learn about what we can do better in the future. And I'll get back to that point when we get to the last room in the house. But before we head up the stairs, I want to point out this item here, or these two items. Anybody know what that is? It is a key. Yes, it is. Carter got it right. It is the key to the Bastille, right? The Bastille was a prison fortress in France. It was used at the time, at the outset of the French Revolution. It was holding arms, and the citizens of Paris stormed the Bastille at the outset of the French Revolution. The Marquis de Lafayette, who was a young man who fought with Washington during the American Revolutionary War, sent that key to Washington as a symbol of what? Any idea what a key to a prison might symbolize? Liberty, right, liberty, freedom. So George Washington received this as President of the United States. He put it in the presidential house in Philadelphia on display. And he returns back here to Mount Vernon. He puts it prominently on display there. Because Washington was viewed by many as kind of the father of liberty. He led America to its independence from Great Britain, freedom, liberty for the American people. So let's go back to this room over here, to the parlor. And let's imagine we're in this room and we're discussing freedom, we're discussing liberty, perhaps the Bastille key, just in the other room is being discussed. And Frank Lee is there in the room. He's expected to be there, be almost invisible, right? He is there to anticipate and react to every whim that the Washingtons have. So in the other room, it's the symbol of this man that stands for freedom, stands for liberty, right? And I want to go back to this coat of arms. Anybody know what the colors were for the Washington coat of arms? If you've ever been to Washington, D.C., it's the exact same color as the flag. It's white and red. Yes, thank you. White and red. Frank Lee wore a uniform mandated by General Washington. It was called a livery. And his uniform was white and red. He had a red waistcoat, white overcoat with red trimming. The whole purpose of the livery was to remind everybody that was visiting the house that this man in this suit was owned by George Washington. And so what were the thoughts going through Frank Lee's head as he's listening to these men talk about freedom and liberty and using words like taxation without representation will turn slaves into all of us? And here's this man thinking, am I not a man too? All of these ideals, do they not apply to me? And I think that's something that's very interesting to think about and consider. Hypocrisy, yeah, you're right, it is. It absolutely is. That painting, that was Washington in the Virginia Regiment uniform. That was the uniform that he designed when he was commander-in-chief during the French and Indian War. All right, so this area here is the upper hall, what Washington referred to it, and it's just a series of bedchambers. So let me give you a quick look through. Was he literate? I assume you're referring to Frank Lee. That's an excellent question. We don't have any writings from Frank Lee himself, though we do know that there were some enslaved people on the estate who were literate. Davy Gray was an overseer, first at Muddy Hole Farm and then over at River Farm. He was an enslaved man that Washington made the overseer, so he actually oversaw the work of the enslaved people on those farms. We know he was literate. And there's reason to believe that Christopher Shields, who was the valet who took over after William Lee, and we'll talk about William Lee and a little bit later when we go to some of the outdoor sites, we believe he was literate because there was a letter that was found where Christopher Shields was planning a runaway attempt. And this letter was actually found, so we believe he was literate as well. Though Washington never taught any of his enslaved people how to read or write. Yeah, the wallpaper is pretty wild. This one we call the Lafayette Room. The Marquis de Lafayette, the man who gave Washington that key, actually stayed here at Mount Vernon. You'll see there's a portrait of him in this room. It's an original. The air return duct was not there in the 18th century. There is air conditioning in the mansion now to help preserve a lot of the objects. Were these paintings expensive at the time? Yes, absolutely. Again, it's another one of those things that only the wealthier people had. Let's see if I can't just jump from room to room this way. The chat box is in the way, so. Yeah, the smoke detectors are a modern thing, kind of something that's required. Okay. This room here actually started out as kind of a storage space. And somebody made the point that it looks like the rooms were kind of like have a Chinese design, right? This one is actually called the chintz room, and that's actually the high fashion of the day. These prints were from China. Very fashionable, have these bird prints and all of this. It was called chintz, high fashion of the day. We actually get the phrase chintzy now because there were so many cheap knockoffs made of this high fashion that it just became associated with cheap. Who was Washington's closest associate? Probably for a long time, you would say probably Alexander Hamilton during the war and even during the presidency. But Edmund Randolph, Tobias Lear, his secretary, were all very close to him. So this passageway here, again, these are all family guest bedchambers. This was a very busy space. In fact, the first year after the presidency, Washington recorded 677 overnight stays. So if one person stayed, if I stayed there for 5 days, right, that would be 5 stays. But 677 is a lot of people. So the question is, who's taking care of all the guests while they're here? Who's changing the sheets? Who's doing the laundry? Who's keeping the fires going? Enslaved people, yes, absolutely. There were 10 to 12 enslaved people inside the mansion. Caroline Branham and Molly were 2 of the enslaved chambermaids that we know were working here in this upper hall area doing a lot of the work. One Judge, if you're familiar with her, we believe she also worked in the mansion as Mrs. Washington's kind of personal kind of valet as well. Yes, she did. She was the one who ran away during the Washington's presidency. So when Carter wrote in, she escaped. You have to understand that slavery in the 18th century is a system that only exists through fear, right? If I can't tell you, go do this, you would just say no, right? Fear is what made that institution a thing. Fear of being punished, fear of being sold away from your family, fear of having one of your family members sold away from you. And these are all things that happened. In fact, during Washington's time, we know that he sold enslaved men down to the Caribbean, which was effectively a death sentence because the working conditions in the Caribbean were so harsh. I think the life expectancy was about 7 or 8 years. And we have this letter where Washington even writes, I think it was Tom was the name of the enslaved man, where he's telling the ship's captain to make sure he's handcuffed to the railing until you're out of sight of land because he knows how to swim, right? And then he goes on just very dispassionately about what he expects in return for the sale of this human, right? And he's talking about liquor and pineapples and things like that. And it's this fear that is so difficult for a lot of people to understand, right? Yes, Washington during the Revolutionary War is seeing black soldiers fighting alongside white soldiers. And 1 in 13 soldiers by the end of the Revolutionary War was a black soldier fighting for American independence. And we do see a shift and a change in Washington's perspective from something that's just purely economic interest for him, building up wealth, right? And this very kind of separated, these are not people, to him really kind of questioning that system a bit. Washington makes some promises when he returns. Yeah, it is racism. You're right. I mean, that's racism itself is a modern-ish concept used to justify, the enslavement of African people in the Western Hemisphere for profit. So Washington then decides he's not going to sell any more enslaved people off of his estate because he doesn't want to break up families, and he goes and we start to see a lot of private writings, right, that he is conflicted with this institution. And we even see while Washington is president of the United States that he's looking to rent his outlying farms to free the enslaved people here and have them work as hired workers out to the people who are in charge of those farms. So yeah, he's making progress, but through all of that, right, he doesn't take a stance as president. He doesn't take a very public stance to say this institution is wrong. right? And even when he's president of the United States and living in Philadelphia, there was a law of gradual emancipation in Pennsylvania, where if an enslaved person was brought into the state and stayed there for 6 months, right, they were then considered free. Washington, we have the letters where Washington's writing back to the farm managers saying, you need to come up with some reason to send these people back to Mount Vernon in 6-month intervals, and please make sure to do it in a way to deceive not only the enslaved people, but also the public, right? Part of that was just so that he could keep, this property and keep the benefit that he got from their labor. And during one of these return trips, an enslaved boy named Austin died during a carriage accident. Austin was actually the half-brother of One Judge. And we think that may have been one of the deciding factors for One Judge to take her chance to run away. And this was a very brave act to do. A lot of people think, well, if I was in that situation, I would just run away. You have to understand that fear was only one part of what made enslavement work in the 18th century. You also had to build a structure around it. Society was built up to support this system, right? If you are a poor white farmer, your interests are actually aligned with enslaved people. If you don't have opportunity, right, it actually works against you to have a free labor source. But racism in society was built up so much that they had to keep kind of this caste system in place. So if you ran away, where exactly are you going to go? The society is built out so that you are always an other and an outsider, right? So Washington, in many cases, historians have argued that Washington didn't take this public stance because of the systemic racism that was in place. If Washington had done that, the whole country would have fallen apart. I think it is okay to criticize Washington and question and say, if there was anybody who had the force, the power to do something about that at that time, perhaps it was George Washington. Any other questions here? This has got a lot of comments there. Oh yeah, the pseudoscience and all that justification. Yeah, it's very interesting. I think Dr. Ibram Kendi, who had just left American University and is heading up to Boston University, has an excellent book that's kind of the history of racism called Stamped from the Beginning. That's an excellent one. I think he also has a younger reader version just called Stamped, all excellent. Here's the other guest bedchamber. I'm going to jump through over here to the private wing. So here we are in the Washington's bedchamber. Quick scroll through. So this was in the private wing of the home. It was built in 1774. General and Mrs. Washington shared this bedchamber, although Mrs. Washington really used this space as her office. Here, this desk, this original French desk, was used by Mrs. Washington, where she would plan menus, educate her grandchildren, whose portraits you see up there on the back wall. And she would also oversee the work of Charlotte, an enslaved seamstress, in this room doing needlework. Now, this bed, the frame itself is original, and it is the bed that George Washington died on, Saturday, December 14th, 1799. He was 67 years old, and he died of what his doctors called quinsy. Now, quinsy in the 18th century was a generic term, and it just meant an inflammation of the throat. I'm going to type it in here. I can. Yes. Yeah. Effectively, his throat began to swell, and he basically suffocated after 36 hours. No, it's not the same mattress. It's the bed frame. A lot of the material itself has deteriorated over 200 years, but the wooden frame itself is the original. Let's zoom out a little bit there. Now, after Washington's death, he was a man who led America to its independence during the Revolutionary War. He was our first president. And really, there was no other identification of America outside of this man. So there were plenty of eulogies and mock funerals that took place all across the country. The country really went into mourning. Men wore black armbands around their arms up until Washington's birth date in February. All right. Well, the whole house is made of wood, and it's still intact too. So wood, if you preserve it and take care of it, will hold up for a long period of time. There were many eulogies, mock funerals given. Probably one that was most famous was given by Light Horse Harry Lee to Congress, where he made the statement, George Washington was first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. Have any of you guys ever heard that phrase? It's a fairly famous one. Yeah. Does anybody know the second part of that, though? That's only the first half of the sentence. First in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen, and second to none in the humble and endearing scenes of private life. Now, Henry Lee was one of the few men who actually knew Washington very well, and actually knew him as more than just the president and all that. And he understood that George Washington and all of his accomplishments, right, were going to be completely overshadowed by George Washington the man. We see that in our history of George Washington. You ask most people about George Washington, the first thing they say is, oh yeah, he's the guy who cut down the cherry tree, right? All that's a myth, right? That whole idea was an early biography to tell about how honest and truthful George Washington was. And so you do that by making up a story, right? He was 67 when he died. And you also see things about throwing a dollar across the Potomac. Well, it's over a mile wide. There's no way they could do that. But there's kind of this mythologizing about his strength, about his virtue and all of that. And the reality is that Washington was, as we all are, a human, right? He was fallible. He made his mistakes. He himself was a part of a heinous system of slavery built around racism. He recognized it. He didn't do enough, perhaps, to do anything about it at the time. But Washington was always a man to look at what we could continue to do to be better. Washington himself doesn't have any sort of foundational document to his name. Thomas Jefferson's got the Declaration of Independence. James Madison is considered, the father of the Constitution. George Washington was involved in all of that. And none of those things really would be possible without Washington's leadership kind of guiding it along the way. And I think one of the tenets of the most important document we have, the Constitution, is in order to form a more perfect union, right? And we see Washington, through all of his mistakes, was trying to set everybody else up, those next generations, to do better. Yeah, his doctors did administer bleeding, but modern medical historians have anticipated or have stated that the amount of blood taken out would have severely weakened him. But given his last words and how he was struggling to breathe, basically believe he suffocated because his epiglottis swelled so much that they cut off his airway. He effectively just suffocated. This is Washington's study. This is an original bookshelf. These books are replicas. They didn't apply leeches to him, but they did apply blistering. So they basically would heat up a piece of metal, apply it, and then it'll cause a blister to form, and then would cut it open and allow that to kind of leak out. It was really, really gross. But no, not leeches. All right, so this is Washington's study. A lot of very interesting pieces in here. All right, so yeah, we'll get to the teeth. I think let's just get to that one right here. George Washington's had multiple sets of dentures. None of them were made of wood, all right? We have speculated that because his dentist's name was Dr. Greenwood, that's where that came from, but it was actually a fifer during the Revolutionary War, believe it or not. Washington's dentures were made of animal ivory. They were made of a type of vegetable ivory. And then he also paid for his enslaved people to have their teeth pulled to put into his dentures as well. It was fairly common practice that Poor people would sell their teeth to be put in. We do not know if Washington asked to have the enslaved people's teeth. We only have the records where it shows where he paid them for those teeth. So yeah, that's another thing that's in there, and I think you can see that on our website. Oh, it looks like Mary posted that. Yep. Yeah, so that's on our website as well. So a lot of objects in this room. They're very interesting. Here we have a fan chair. Pump the pedals at your feet. It moves the blade back and forth over your head to create a nice breeze to cool you off. Washington saw that when he was in Philadelphia during the Constitutional Convention. Had to purchase that as kind of the 18th century air conditioning system. And over here, the important pieces are this chair and this desk. These are both original objects. They were purchased. The chair is the one that Washington sat in when he was president of the United States. Matthew, hold on to that question. What could slaves even do with their money? Because I will talk about that when we go outside to the outer areas. Washington did give money and to enslaved people fairly often, and we'll discuss that. We also have the desk here. He purchased that at the end of his presidency and brought it back with him to Mount Vernon. Now, all these are very important pieces, right? Because of what they symbolize. When Washington was president, how many terms could a president serve? Any ideas? Unlimited, right. There weren't any term limits when George Washington was president. Term limits wouldn't come about until the passing of the 22nd Amendment after the FDR presidency. So before that, the only thing that kept presidents from serving more than 2 terms was the fact that George Washington, after his second term in office, said, I am not going to run for a 3rd term. I'm going to step down and give the power entrusted in me by the people of the country back to them so they can determine who their president would be. And that, I think, is very important because Washington setting that example, one, gives us the example of the peaceful exchange of power from one elected official to the next. But it also sets the precedent of a president not abusing the power that they're in, becoming a dictator or a king, which was something that everybody was worried about happening. So we can see it here, some more of that myth building. Here we have an original relief by Joseph Wright of George Washington. He's got these laurel wreaths on his head. People say, oh, that's Washington as Caesar. Oh, the laurel wreath just means victory. And this was a gift after he was commander-in-chief, right? So it shows Washington as the victorious commander. Had some questions about the bust. This one up here is George Washington. This was a gift to Washington from a man named Jean-Antoine Houdon, who was a celebrated French sculptor. The original is in our museum, so you can see that there, but that replica shows that. This is John Paul Jones, an early American naval hero. John Paul Jones had 14 of these busts made, and he gave them out to a whole bunch of different people, right? So Thomas Jefferson has the exact same bust at Monticello. You can see that they were both, yeah, they are secured in there. In fact, when we got hit by an earthquake a few years ago, they were all firmly in place, so you don't have to worry about they're going to fall. And this is also an original piece. That's Jacques Necker, who was the French Minister of Finance. He helped finance the American Revolutionary War effort, right? Any other questions about the house before we step outside? All right. Actually, let me go over here, step inside the kitchen. So this is the kitchen. It is also an original building. You see the oven, bake oven over here, kind of the smoke jack fireplace build out area behind us are 2 more rooms. The larder over here on the left was used for food storage. You can see there's a turkey getting ready to be prepared day of and some spices in there. It's dug out. It's a little bit cooler. Over here, this is the scullery. This is where they did all of the cleaning and prep work before getting ready to do the cooking. Now, of course, there were enslaved individuals working inside the kitchen. Lucy, Nathan, Hercules were all enslaved cooks here at various times. Hercules was actually brought up to Philadelphia to be the cook for Washington when he was president of the United States. He initially hired a cook and just wasn't happy with what he was able to do. So that kind of goes to show just how skilled some of these enslaved people were, right? Hercules was well versed in the culinary arts, the French cooking styles, and the skill level needed, right? If you look over here, this bake oven, you would basically build a fire up inside, and then you would kind of close it off. You'd rake out the coals once it was up to heat, and put the front. That fence is for us for the visitor path. It's just to keep people from touching things they're not supposed to, because guests walk through there in the normal tour. So that fence would not have been there in the 18th century. But anyway, do you know how they knew the oven was up to heat? How the enslaved cooks knew? There wasn't a beeper that went off. They had actually could hold their hand into the oven, and based on how long they could hold it in, they would determine how hot it was. So, you know, however many seconds for 350, however many for 500, right? So this is how they learned. How did Hercules learn? He was taught by the other enslaved people who were here before him. Old Doll was one of the enslaved women who came to Mount Vernon with Mrs. Washington when she married the general in 1759. And she was very skilled, taught by other enslaved people before her. Okay. Was Washington considered handsome back then? Yes. He was very tall. He stood at 6'2½". He had auburn hair, which is the same color hair I used to have before it all started retreating from my head. And yeah, he was considered a very handsome man. All right. So again, going back to that landscaping, I want to take a look over here in this grove, right? Washington had black locusts and lilacs planted over here. Any ideas why he would want this screening the view of the river? Any idea? That landscape was put in to block the view of the work buildings over here, all right? So again, we have the salt houses where salt was stored, which is very important for meat preservation. Over here, I don't think the trees are going to stop the enslaved people from escaping. It was purely aesthetics to cover up the view from the work buildings, right? Over here is the spinning room. You had, usually these were hired servants who'd come in and would do the loom work over here, because they could do it really, really quickly, while enslaved people would take wool and linen and run it into the threads to get it ready to go from there. Go right over here. There was a well in the basement. It was a dry well, though. It was not good for holding ice. It would all melt. He did have an ice house that was built into the countryside, and that worked a lot better. So here's the blacksmith shop. Washington had initially indentured servants working in the blacksmith shop. A man named Grubner, who was either Dutch or German, started out here. And then eventually two enslaved men, Nat and George, worked inside the mansion. As mentioned, Washington made arrangements in his will to free the enslaved people that he owned upon the death of Mrs. Washington. Dr. Bradburn mentioned that. Nat and George were both owned by George Washington, so they both received their emancipation in January of 1801. However, their wives, Lucy and Lydia, were owned by the Custis estate. So they remained enslaved. So you can imagine, again, there was the natural breaking up of families, even through freedom. Now, George, probably in an effort to stay with his family, stayed on at Mount Vernon and was hired as the blacksmith. And we have a receipt from the Washington family where George received payment of $50 over the course of the year to work as the blacksmith at Mount Vernon. And again, he wasn't literate. He just kind of drew like an X, and that's it, because he didn't know how to actually write out his name. But again, that shows a little bit of the lives of the individuals that took place here afterwards. All right, now I'm going to jump over to Kevin. So now I'm on the North Lane. There's a large brick building along the North Lane, just around the corner from the Blacksmith Shop. And these are the slave quarters. Now, there were 317 individuals on the entire state. As I mentioned, at the Mansion House Farm, there was about 90, I think it was like 89 people. And the majority lived in these bunk-like structures, very much modeled after what Washington had built during the war. Here's that livery I was talking about that Frank Lee wore inside the mansion, the white with the red facing. You can see the bedding consisted of straw, right? We don't know how many people were in any of these quarters, right? You could have potentially 2 or 3 individuals in each one of these bunks, these berths, right? We have personal belongings. Somebody asked, what would they buy with that money? Well, in Alexandria on Sunday mornings, with Washington's permission, enslaved people could go and attend a marketplace. It would open up before the market officially began, and enslaved people could sell things there. We know that the enslaved people at Mount Vernon kept their own garden plots where they would grow produce to kind of supplement their meals. They kept chickens, so they would often sell eggs. They would keep beehives, and they would sell honey. We have from Washington's own accounts where he is purchasing eggs and honey from his own enslaved people at the marketplace in Alexandria, right? Alexandria is a town just north of here. It's about 12 miles away or so. And here we see combs, belt buckles. It was also not uncommon to see dolls or jewelry being purchased, dolls for children, right? Sometimes extra blankets. The amount of money that is being given as tips or even gifts from visitors, it was kind of the custom at the time that you would tip an enslaved person who was as a chambermaid in the house. It's not a lot of money, right? It's these little things, but you have to understand how important these personal belongings are. So I see a lot of people saying, you could buy your freedom, you could buy your freedom. Washington's never going to give enough money or the opportunity to get enough money for them to purchase their own freedom away from them. The amount of money is way too much, right? We're talking about enough money to buy a belt buckle or a comb, not enough to buy freedom. How much does freedom cost? You're looking at anywhere between 300 and 600 pounds. And the money back then was so fluid, it's very difficult to say. But a lot of historians today say that each enslaved person in the good, like working age, right, was about as expensive as a car today. So you're looking at like, $30,000 in today's money for each individual. So yeah, it's not something that many people are ever going to be able to do. That being said, there are instances of that happening, even here at Mount Vernon. Sambo Anderson, and Sambo was a fairly common name. It meant second son. He actually was one of the few enslaved people who was born in Africa and was brought over to the New World, and Washington purchased him. He was a Washington slave. He received his freedom per Washington's will. And his family too were Custis slaves. Washington, although he recognized marriages among his enslaved people, even though Virginia did not, this meant that all of his wife, his children remained enslaved. Sambo Anderson worked as a trapper, as a hunter, and sold food to hotels and high-class clientele in the Alexandria area. he eventually was able to save up enough money to purchase the freedom of his children, grandchildren, and I think like 2 great-grandchildren. So we do see that happening from time to time. Over here, we can see these sacks were the food allotment, right? They were given about 5 to 8 ounces. They was given all as like a month ration, right, all at once. And then they would have, the enslaved people would have to ration that out. These 2 fish kind of show you about the protein, 5 to 8 ounces of a protein. It was usually salted fish or pork. And over here, that bowl is about 1 day's worth of the grain allotment, right? So now let's get to the question that people ask all the time. Again, probably the #1 question that gets asked here at Mount Vernon. Was George Washington a good slave owner, right? To begin with, there is no such thing as a good slave owner, right? Even if that means you never whipped a slave, if you never abused them, right, which is extremely unlikely that that system could even work if that were the case, you are still holding a person in bondage against their will. You are still holding a human being as property. You are, through the process, denying them their basic humanity. You have to understand, again, that it was racism that made all of this system work. You had to internalize the dehumanization as a slave owner, and you had to believe that these people were less than you, right? There's no way around it. And what you see, particularly in modern American history post-Civil War, is once slavery was deemed illegal, right, and people were emancipated, you see kind of this history that goes back that says, well, slavery really wasn't all that bad. People were treated fairly. They were given a place to live. They were given food. In many cases, their lives were better, right? These are all rationalizations that were used to kind of justify this horrific system. And I think a perfect example of that, now that we're into women's, who was the least racist slave owner? Again, that doesn't exist. You have to be, there is no level of racism, right? You're racist or you're anti-racist. There is no not racist, all right? So I think that's an important distinction to make, all right? Everybody who can be a part of the system can at least recognize what is racist and try to push towards policies and systems that go against that, right? So you're either racist or you're anti-racist. And George Washington struggled towards the end, had some anti-racist views, but I think ultimately you'd have to say was racist for not taking action during his lifetime. But here in the women's bunk, it is possible, again, we don't know, that Ona Judge may have lived in this space here, right? Now, Ona Judge, we mentioned, ran away during the Washington presidency. She was in Philadelphia. There was a strong community there to help support the community. There was a free population there. Excuse me, I'm stumbling on my words here. She eventually ran away free, ended up in Vermont. We know George Washington put out advertisements, right, to bring her back. It was within his legal right at the time, as laid out in the Constitution, right, to bring this property back, right, this chattel property back to Mount Vernon. Part of it was that Ona Judge was a custis slave. So in Washington, there was an extra pecuniary issue in that if she did run away, right, George Washington would have to pay the custis estate for that loss in property, right? Now, Mrs. Washington was absolutely beside herself. She was on record, we have letters where she's writing to her sister where she just, or it's actually George Washington writing to, I think, his sister, talking about how Mrs. Washington just cannot understand why Ona would run away. Mrs. Washington said, we treated her like family, right? She had better clothing. She was not mistreated here, right? And Mrs. Washington actually offered when Washington slave catchers found her to say, if you come back, there will be no punishment whatsoever. We just want to return you back into the family. But that's the thing that we have to remember, right? A lot of people take that viewpoint and what Mrs. Washington is saying to say, yeah, there are good slave owners. They didn't mistreat her, right? But what was Ona's actions? She ran away. She didn't come back. It's all about perspective, right? What we are seeing here is what's generally called the paternalistic view of slavery, right? That the slave owner was kind of like this father figure who took care of these enslaved people. Then in this case, it's a maternalistic view where Mrs. Washington's like, oh no, she was part of the family. But that goes against the fact that during the Revolutionary War, 17 individuals took their chance at freedom by running away on a British frigate called the Savage to run for their freedom. 7 of those individuals were sent back to George Washington at the Battle of Yorktown. The battle that secured American freedom also secured enslavement for 7 individuals, right? It doesn't change the fact that Caesar, a man who was well known as a preacher, so we also believe was literate, we have runaway ads taken by Washington where he's running away. He ran away 12 times. He kept coming back. We believe, probably now, that he was leaving to go see a family member on another plantation. Again, that's what the institution does. It keeps family away and is all arbitrary at the whims of the person who says that they own them, right? So Ona Judge eventually was interviewed. Although she got away, right? She never, in the eyes of the law, was ever free. She always remained a fugitive. So for her entire life, she had to be worried about that person coming around the corner, right? Because custom slaves were never freed. And she was interviewed later on by the member of the community up in Vermont about whether she regretted not going back to Mount Vernon, because at this point in time, she had outlived all of her children, she outlived her husband, and she was absolutely destitute. It actually took people in the community to help support her in her life, right, to keep her going. And she said, no, because I am free, and because of it, I am a child of God. That tells you all you need to know, right? It doesn't matter what the treatment was. It's all about dehumanization, right? It's all about fear. And you can make the brave choice to not live in fear. And that's what she did. Good question. How religious was Washington? He was very much involved in the Anglican Church. Whoops. There we go. The Anglican Church, when he was growing up, that was the official religion of Virginia. At the time, Washington was a vestryman. He was very active as a member of the vestry. But then Washington had kind of some issues after the war. When the Anglican Church became the Episcopalian Church, he stopped taking communion and was actually called out as President of the United States in a church service for skipping out. And so at that point, he just not participating. So from that point on, he would actually just leave the service before the communion started. Washington's views on religion are very difficult for us to put down. All of the family members write that he was a religious person, but he was not very public about it. And the family even said that he felt that his religious viewpoints were his alone. We got a lot of good write-up on our website, and our research historian, Mary Thompson, actually has 2 books out. One is on the enslaved people of Mount Vernon. It's fantastic. And another one is actually on religion. So she kind of tackles 2 of those bigger topics here. All right, let's see, gardens and landscapes. I'm going to take us down now, just because I know we've got to finish up around 3, and I keep on going. I'm a talker. I want to take you down here to the slave memorials and cemetery. So this area here, all of this ground is very close to George Washington's tomb, which was built in the 1830s. There was an older tomb. Washington was moved. We kind of poked through the trees. It's actually just right here on the other side. But all of this ground here, there are unmarked graves of enslaved individuals. Right now, we've identified at least 80 individuals we know of are buried down here. And that is because of some archaeology that we're doing. If you look here, they dig down just a couple of inches. And you see right here where the ground is a different color. The graves are dug down 6 feet. And then when they take that dirt out, it gets oxygenated, right? when it gets exposed. And then you bury it back in, you fill it back in, that dirt's going to be a different color, right? So they're going down just a couple inches. They're not actually going to any grave shafts or anything, but that way they can see where they are. And we're working on trying to find a proper way to actually set up these memorials here. This was right after the first year of the dig, and you can see that we put flowers to commemorate all of these sites. Right now we've got like this white crushed sand stone that we put up over each of the graves, so it really stands out. And if I can get this to work, play a video for you guys of a drone flyover. See if I can change the quality so you can actually hear the sound. All right, so I guess there was no sound on that, but that was Joe Downer, who's one of our archaeologists, talking about the site, talking about the dig. Well, you can see the video here. This is the team and work. They go down again just a couple of inches and identify all of those. If you go onto our website, there's a section there where there's actually some drone footage that flies over. Now the memorials here. In 1929, the Mount Vernon Ladies Association put in a memorial here. And I'll bring this one up too, because I think this is very important to have a discussion on what sites like ours need to be doing going forward. You can see this memorial was actually one of the first of its kind in the country. Prior to that, there were no monuments put up to enslaved people at cemetery sites. But I want you to look at the language used. In memory of the many faithful colored servants of the Washington family. The language that was used there, first off, faithful and servants. That language was specifically used to soften the institution of slavery. And it also goes to say that they were there voluntarily, right? So this language is very misleading to just how difficult and just how atrocious the institution of slavery actually is. And I think this serves as kind of a physical reminder to us and other museums across the country that we really need to be intentional with the language that we are using, right, when we are discussing enslavement. Hopefully, I was able to do that with you guys, and that you can carry on this conversation to look forward. Again, our union isn't perfect. George Washington was there to help create a country that always was striving for a more perfect union. So I think there's a lot to learn here through the stories of the enslaved people and through Washington's accomplishments and through Washington's, where Washington fell short. But I think we can all come together and keep pushing ourselves to do better, be better. I mean, we're even seeing that in the chat here as everybody's kind of coming and working through all of this themselves. Going back, that memorial was largely ignored until the 1980s, when this monument was put in place. It was designed by Howard University students. Howard University is a historically Black college in Washington, D.C. Their architects built this out, dedicated it in 1983. Okay, so with that, I think we're at the end. Katie, I don't know if there are any other questions that I missed, if there's anything specific that you want me to cover, but I know I've had a good time, so hopefully the students did too.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much. There's a lot of questions, but we're going to be jumping back into our classrooms. So guys, if you have any further questions, join back into your classroom Zooms with your teacher, and hopefully we can continue those discussions there. And thank you so much, Jeremy and Sadie and everyone for your time today.
Yeah, and I'll be happy to, if you guys want to email me any questions, I'll be happy to do any follow-ups that I didn't get to.
That's great. I'll get your email out. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you all. Enjoy the
Thank
rest
you.
of the week.
Thank you, guys.